It started with a simple email, or at least, it seemed simple at the time. I was sitting at my desk, the soft glow of my computer screen the only light in my apartment, when the notification chimed. The subject line read, "You shouldn't have looked." Normally, I'd dismiss it as spam and move on, but something about it caught my attention. Maybe it was the phrasing, or maybe it was the late hour messing with my judgment. Against my better instincts, I clicked. The email contained a single line of text. "Click here to see what you've done." Below it, a link. I hovered over it, my cursor trembling slightly. I'd heard all the warnings about phishing scams and malicious sites, but curiosity got the better of me. After all, I hadn't done anything wrong. What could this possibly be about? The link led to a website with a blank black screen and a single word: watch. Beneath it was a play button. My heart was pounding now, but I told myself it was probably just some prank or elaborate ad. So, like a fool, I pressed play. The video began with a shaky handheld camera moving through a dense forest at night. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves underfoot and the distant hum of insects. My unease grew as the perspective shifted, as though whoever held the camera was searching for something, or someone. Then the camera stopped. It focused on a figure standing motionless among the trees, their back turned to the lens. They were wearing a hoodie, the hood pulled up so I couldn't see their face. The camera zoomed in slowly, and that's when I realized something horrifying. The figure was wearing my hoodie, the exact one I was wearing at that very moment. I froze, my mind racing. It had to be a coincidence, right? Plenty of people own black hoodies. But as the figure turned toward the camera, my breath caught in my throat. It was me. My face stared back at me, pale and expressionless, eyes hollow and unblinking. The screen went black. I sat there, paralyzed, until the sound of my phone buzzing snapped me out of it. The caller ID showed an unknown number, but I answered anyway, desperate for some explanation. A voice, raspy and cold, whispered, "You shouldn't have looked." The line went dead. Panic surged through me. I shut my laptop and checked the locks on my doors and windows. Everything was secure. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I closed the curtains and turned on every light in the apartment, but the sense of unease only grew stronger. That night, sleep was impossible. I kept hearing faint noises, the creak of floorboards, the rustle of fabric, but every time I checked, the apartment was empty. By morning, I was exhausted and jumpy, but I convinced myself it had all been some elaborate hoax. Someone had found a way to manipulate footage, and I'd fallen for it. But the next day, another email arrived. This one had an attachment, a photo of me sitting at my desk, taken from just outside my window. My stomach dropped. I lived on the 3rd floor. I called the police, but they weren't much help. They said there was no sign of forced entry and no evidence of a stalker. Probably just a prank, the officer said, though he didn't sound convinced. Over the next few days, the emails kept coming. Each one was worse than the last. A video of me sleeping, a recording of my own voice whispering things I'd never said, a photo of me walking home, with a shadowy figure trailing behind. I started to feel like I was losing my mind. Then one night, I woke up to the sound of my own voice. It was coming from the living room. Heart pounding, I grabbed the closest thing I could use as a weapon, a heavy lamp, and crept toward the sound. The TV was on, playing another video. This time it showed a live feed of me standing in the living room, holding the lamp. But there was something wrong with the image. Behind me, in the corner of the frame, was a shadow that didn't belong. It shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, but I could feel it watching me. I spun around, swinging the lamp wildly, but there was nothing there. When I turned back to the TV, the screen was black. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, and I nearly dropped the lamp in fright. Another message. "Run." I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my keys and bolted out the door, not stopping until I reached my car. I drove aimlessly, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the wheel. Eventually, I ended up at a motel on the outskirts of town. The clerk gave me a strange look as I stumbled in, disheveled and panicked, but I didn't care. I just needed to feel safe. For a while, it worked. The emails stopped, and I started to convince myself it was over. But last night, as I lay in the motel bed, I heard a familiar sound, the chime of an email notification. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't resist. The subject line read, "Found you." And now, as I write this, I can feel it. That shadow. It's here with me, just out of sight, waiting. I don't know what it wants or why it chose me, but I know one thing for sure. It's not going to let me go. I've never been one to believe in ghosts, curses, or the supernatural. My world was built on logic, concrete, verifiable, and explainable. But some events defy reason, leaving you with no choice but to accept that something darker exists. My name is Alan, and what happened to me 2 years ago still keeps me awake at night. It started with a house. I had recently finalized my divorce and needed a fresh start. The house was old, far out in the countryside, surrounded by thick woods. It was cheap, almost suspiciously so, but I didn't care. It was my chance to rebuild. The moment I stepped inside, I felt it. A faint unease, like the air was heavier than it should be. I chalked it up to nerves. The first few nights were uneventful. I spent my time unpacking and trying to adjust to the deafening silence of the countryside. Then, on the 5th night, I woke up at exactly 3:03 a.m. No sound, no disturbance, just a sudden jolt from deep sleep to wide awake. I glanced at the clock, annoyed, and rolled over to go back to sleep. That's when I heard it. Faint footsteps coming from upstairs. I froze. The logical part of my brain told me it was probably the house settling, or some animal. But these footsteps weren't random. They were deliberate, steady, moving directly above my bedroom. I grabbed a flashlight and crept up the stairs, every creak of the old wood echoing in the silence. The upstairs hallway was empty. Doors to the bedrooms were shut. I checked each room. Nothing. No signs of animals, no broken windows, nothing to explain the noise. Uneasy, I went back to bed. But I didn't sleep. The next night, it happened again. 3:03 a.m. footsteps. This time I didn't hesitate. I bolted upstairs, flashlight trembling in my hand. As I reached the top, a chilling draft swept past me, freezing the sweat on my skin. One of the bedroom doors was open, even though I was sure I had closed it the night before. Inside, the room was empty, save for an old rocking chair that hadn't been there before. It sat in the center of the room, facing the window. The chair swayed slightly, as if someone had just stood up from it. I told myself it must have been left behind by the previous owner, though I couldn't explain how it had appeared overnight. I moved it to the basement, locked the door, and tried to forget about it. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger. During the day, shadows seemed to move just out of sight. At night, the footsteps continued, now accompanied by faint whispers I couldn't quite make out. One night, desperate for answers, I called the real estate agent who had sold me the house. When I mentioned the odd occurrences, she went silent for a moment before nervously laughing it off. "Old houses have their quirks," she said, but I could hear the hesitation in her voice. When I pressed her, she admitted that the previous owner had left abruptly, refusing to talk about why. By now I was barely sleeping. Every noise set my nerves on edge. Then came the night I can never forget. I had barricaded myself in my bedroom, determined to make it through until morning. At exactly 3:03 a.m., the footsteps started again. But this time they didn't stop. They grew louder, closer, descending the stairs to my bedroom door. I held my breath as the doorknob rattled violently, then stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. Suddenly, the temperature in the room plummeted. My breath fogged in the air. A voice whispered my name, low and guttural, coming from just behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were a cacophony of voices screaming, crying, and laughing all at once. I fled the house that night, leaving everything behind. Later, I found out the house had a dark history. In the early 1900s, a family had lived there, only to vanish without a trace. Over the years, every owner had reported strange occurrences, but the stories were always dismissed as superstition. I sold the house at a loss, desperate to put it behind me. Even now, in the safety of my new apartment, I can't escape it. I wake up at 3:03 a.m. every night, heart pounding, straining to hear footsteps that aren't there. And sometimes when the lights are off, I feel the weight of unseen eyes watching me, waiting. Whatever haunted that house hasn't let me go, and I'm terrified it never will. I'm not sure why I'm writing this. Maybe I just need to get it out, or maybe I'm hoping someone can explain what happened. Either way, what I'm about to tell you is the truth, as unbelievable as it might sound. It started last winter, during one of those brutally cold nights when the wind howls like a pack of wolves and the sky is an unbroken sheet of black. I had just moved into a small, isolated cabin on the edge of a dense forest. The idea was to escape the chaos of the city and finally work on the novel I'd been putting off for years. The cabin was cheap, and the landlord seemed eager to rent it out. In hindsight, that should have been my first red flag. The first couple of nights were uneventful. I unpacked, got used to the eerie silence of the forest, and started sketching out ideas for my book. But on the third night, I woke up to a strange noise. It wasn't loud, just out of place. A faint scratching, like nails on wood, coming from somewhere outside. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the front door. My breath fogged the air as I stepped onto the porch. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but snow and shadows. I convinced myself it was a branch scraping against the cabin and went back to bed. The next morning I noticed something odd. There were tracks in the snow, not animal tracks, but human footprints. They circled the cabin, weaving in and out of the trees before disappearing into the forest. I told myself it must have been a hiker or a hunter, but deep down, I felt uneasy. That night the scratching returned. This time it was louder, more insistent. I lay in bed, heart pounding, listening as it moved around the cabin, scratching at the walls, the windows, the door. It stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed was almost worse. I didn't sleep a wink. The next morning the footprints were back, fresh in the snow. They were closer to the cabin now, and there were more of them. I decided to call the landlord. His voice was strained when he answered, and when I told him about the noises and the footprints, there was a long pause. You didn't see anything, did you?" he asked. "See what?" I demanded. "Never mind," he muttered. "It's probably nothing. Just keep your doors locked at night, okay?" That evening I double-checked every lock and window before the sun went down. I even moved a heavy dresser in front of the front door, but none of it made me feel safe. As the hours crept by, the scratching returned. It was more frantic now, more aggressive. It sounded like whatever was out there was trying to claw its way inside. And then I heard it. A low, guttural voice whispering my name. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up. The voice was coming from just outside the window by my bed. I didn't dare move, didn't even breathe. The whispering continued, growing louder, more insistent. "Come outside," it hissed. "We just want to talk." I clenched my fists, trying to summon the courage to grab my phone and call for help. But then I realized something chilling. My phone was still on the kitchen counter, and to get it, I'd have to walk past the window. The thought of whatever was out there seeing me made my stomach churn. Hours passed. The whispering stopped, but the scratching didn't. Eventually it faded with the first light of dawn. When I finally worked up the nerve to look outside, I almost screamed. The footprints weren't just around the cabin anymore. They were on the porch, right by the door. And there were handprints, smudged and bloody, on the windows. I packed my things that morning, planning to leave. But as I loaded my car, I noticed something strange. The trees at the edge of the forest weren't just trees. They were wrong, twisted and gnarled with deep gouges that looked like claw marks. And in the largest tree, just visible among the branches, was a symbol carved into the bark, a crude, jagged circle with an X through it. I don't know what it means. I don't want to know. I drove away and never looked back. The landlord didn't answer when I called to tell him I was leaving, And when I went back to the city, I couldn't find any record of him or the property. It's been months now, but I still hear the scratching in my dreams. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear that voice, low and guttural, whispering my name.